In this video, I'm going to show you how to use StatCrunch to help you answer the online homework problems. So here I'm in the section 2.1 homework, and I'm going to use the arrow keys at the top to jump ahead to skip to a problem that has a graph I need to build. So here's problem number 6. I have a frequency table here of responses to a national survey. How often do you eat out for dinner instead of at home? Never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always. Here's all the people's responses. And they want you to make a relative frequency distribution over here. So there's a little link up here above the frequency table. It says click to copy the table. I click on that, and one of the options is to open in StatCrunch. You can also copy it to a clipboard, or you can save it as some other type of file that you can open in Excel. But I'm going to click on Open in StatCrunch. So when it opens in StatCrunch, it's got that same table that I had before. Never, rarely, so on and so forth, the response with the frequencies. And what I can do then is build a bar graph. So I come up here to Graph, Bar Plot, and I'll do it with summary because it's a frequency table and not the raw data, so I'm doing it with summary. My categories are in the response column, so I'll click response. The counts are in the frequency column. I want to build a relative frequency bar plot so I can actually see the relative frequencies, and then I can just copy those over. I can write those over. I'm going to do it order by how the responses are currently, so never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always. So that's ordered by worksheet. I'm going to use the same order that's on the worksheet here. And I want to choose value above bar so I can actually see those relative frequencies. So when I hit compute, it's a little hard to see, so we'll expand that. So this little button right here with the arrows going in every direction, that'll expand it. So now I've got my values: never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always. So I'll come back over here. So the never column, or the never response, gets 0.078, so I'll come in here and say 0.078. Rarely is the next one, 0.268. Sometimes is the next one, that's 0.455. The next one is most of the time, that's 0.161. And always is 0.037. It's already rounded it to 3 decimal places for me. And if you ever need to see the full value, if you need to round it to something else, notice if I hover over the bar, it'll say, like this one says, 0.1613536, but it rounds it to 3 decimal places. So you can always get more decimal places from StatCrunch. Like this one is 0.26777, and it rounds it to 0.268. Alright. After I put in the values, I'm going to say check my answer, and all of them are correct because it did the calculation for me. And then it says what percent of respondents answered always. Well, always is this column down here, and it's 0.037, so I need to move the decimal 2 places to change this to 3.7%. Then it says what percent of respondents answered never or rarely. So here's never and here's rarely. Well, I need to combine those two. That's 7.8% here and 26.8% for rarely. So over here I've got this little calculator. Click the calculator and open it, and I want to take the never folks and the rarely folks. So put 0.078 plus 0.268, and that tells me 0.346. So that's 34.6 when I convert it to a percent. That's good. And that's okay, so that's the answers to those, and then I need to pick a frequency bar graph for this. Well, the frequency bar graph is going to look exactly the same. Here, I'm going to close this calculator with a little X up here. The frequency bar graph will look identical to the relative frequency bar graph, except that it'll have frequencies on the side instead of relative frequencies. And notice it has it in the order never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always. So if I go back, take a look at this graph, it looks sort of like a triangle shape. So that's the one that looks most like the frequency bar graph that I created. That's the bar graph. That's the one this is the one I created, and this is the one that it looks most like it. So I'm going to click that, and it'll say great. So that's how you use StatCrunch from within inside the homework. Just click this little box up here to open your data in StatCrunch. Do your work in StatCrunch, figure out the answers like we did here. You don't even have to save this off, just keep it open. Come back here, enter your answers, figure out the rest of the problem. And then when you're done, you can just close this window and it'll close StatCrunch for you. And then you're done, and just move on to the next question. Oh, one more question. Relative frequency bar graph, and that one looks also the same. We could also get that from StatCrunch. And, oh, pie chart. Well, let's see, I closed it, so since I closed it, let me do this one. I'm going to open it again in StatCrunch. And it's got the same data, that hasn't changed at all. So I'll go to graph, pie chart, and again I'm using summary because I'm using a frequency table, not the raw data. And we're going to display, what does it want me to display here? It just wants me to display it, see what it looks like, and it's got it in the order never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always. The order that it's listed here, so that's the worksheet order. So down here I again want to say order by worksheet, so it puts them in that order. And it doesn't really matter too much which one I use here, but I want to say categories are in the response column, counts are in the frequency column, and I'll go ahead and do compute. And so it's doing never, rarely, sometimes, most of the time, and always, the same order that it has it up here. So we'll go back to StatCrunch. I'll expand that a little bit. So never is in blue. So let's just see. Never, rarely is in red. Rarely is this big one here. So far that's right. Never, and then rarely. Sometimes this big one over here. Most of the time, not quite. So let's see. Never, rarely is over here. Sometimes is this one, not quite half of the pie, so that looks right. Mostly is a pretty big wedge here, so it looks like that. And always is this really tiny wedge right here. So if I compare this graph with what I got in StatCrunch, this graph looks the closest. So let's check that. I'll click that, check answer, and that's correct. That's the closest one. And then has one last question for you to answer. But that's how you can use StatCrunch, or how you can import the data directly from the question into StatCrunch, and then build the graphs and do all the work, have StatCrunch do the work for you, and then just come back to your homework. As long as you've got them both up, you can fill in the values and be done. Alright, and then click save, and then you'll move on.